Do you often judge or berate yourself for being affected in the way that you have been by really anything in your life? Have you told yourself that if you were just stronger or better in some way, that you wouldn't have been as affected, or you would be further along in your healing? Do you think it means something about you when you feel like you've made some progress in your healing and find yourself struggling again? Do you think that it says something about you and your capacity for healing? If so, if you can relate to any of that, first, know that you're not alone. And second, hopefully today's video will help. Thank you for being here. If you're new, welcome to the channel. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Make sure to subscribe and click the little bell for notifications. So you really are definitely not alone. And this is something that comes up with people all the time, not just people that I work with, but people have even just sent emails and asked questions about things related to this. And I read something earlier that made me decide to do this video. So, and the reason I want to do this video is because what I read earlier is a great example of how in our everyday lives our beliefs are reinforced. And it doesn't have to be something bad at all. It can be neutral, it can actually even be positive. But because of how we interpret it, it reinforces those negative beliefs. Because remember, as humans, so it's not just people that have experienced trauma, but as humans, we are kind of constantly searching, especially if we feel vulnerable, if we're filled with self-doubt or anxiety, we are constantly searching for things that are potentially risky or dangerous, things that might make us feel bad. We're also searching for the things that reinforce what we already believe, the confirmation bias. So even when we read or see or hear something that can be positive, we can interpret it in a way that reinforces something about ourselves that we believe. Not that it's true, but we believe it. And when you think about how often this can happen in our daily lives, those core beliefs are being reinforced over and over and over again. And because we already believe it, that belief isn't going anywhere, right? And so every time it's reinforced, it just builds the foundation for that even further. It just lets it grab hold even more. And even if there's positive things coming in, because these false beliefs take up so much space, there's no room for the positive. So the example from today for me was I read something that was actually a positive thing. It was somebody sharing a little bit about her abuse experience, but mostly just that she had done a lot of healing. And what she said early on, so I think her abuse started relatively young, and then it stopped when she was, I guess, a preteen. But what she said immediately caught my attention, because I know how easily it can be heard and reinforced within us when we doubt ourselves. And I think it's partly my experience, personally, my abuse experience, and how I kind of tended to navigate the world. And I think that it's also just part of having worked with survivors for as long as I have, that no matter what is going on in my life, I read something, I watch something, I hear something, and I always experience it from that lens of how could this be interpreted? Because there are so many ways that we can take something that is completely benign, that we can take that as something negative about us. It doesn't even have to be about us. It can be somebody else sharing their personal experience, but we can interpret it in a way that reinforces those core beliefs. So in this particular example, the person shared that she had been abused, and then as a preteen, the abuse stopped because her abuser, I made a note here, so let me just reflect on this for a second. The abuse ended as I became more aware and he became fearful, seeing that I was a strong teenager. So take a moment, pause if you need to. Take a moment and notice what you took from that. So I'm going to read that again. It ended as I became more aware and he became fearful, seeing that I was a strong teenager. So, it's possible that you didn't take anything at all from that other than good for her. That's great. I am so glad that the abuse stopped. I'm glad that she felt strong and that helped her abuse end. It's possible that that's all you took from it. It's possible that on a conscious level, you're aware that there were other things that came to mind. And what is really, really important here is what you may have taken from it that you're not conscious of. Because as you've heard me say before, the things that are happening below our consciousness are the things that have the most impact on us because we can't challenge it. So, if you're not aware that there was anything that felt not so great that was stirred up, and you truly felt like, oh, good for her, and nothing happened internally, then that's great. But for a lot of people, in reading that statement, and obviously she was just talking about herself, right? She wasn't saying she was strong and other people aren't. She wasn't saying anything bad at all. But what can so easily happen, and she mentions being stopped at preteen and being a rebellious teenager or a strong teenager. What people can read into that is, oh, if I had been stronger, maybe my abuse would have stopped. Or my abuse didn't stop because clearly I wasn't strong. Or even thinking that maybe your abuse would have stopped sooner. Or any number of things. Honestly, you could have 100 different survivors in a room and come up with at least 50 different thoughts. And I'm not saying 100 different thoughts because we tend to have a lot of the same thoughts that reinforce those beliefs, right? But really, the exact thing that you're saying to yourself may be different than what somebody else is going to say, but you're going to find a way, if you believe that you are at fault somehow, that you should have stopped it, that you could have done something, if you've believed that you're weak in any way whatsoever, which is kind of the opposite of strong, right? So when you hear somebody say, he stopped because he became fearful that I was strong, what can easily be taken from that is, well, because I was weak, my abuser wasn't afraid. And so it's my fault because I wasn't strong enough. And again, maybe you are consciously aware of some thought, and maybe it wasn't even about strength, maybe it was something else that maybe didn't leave you feeling so great. And when we do that on a conscious level, it still doesn't feel good, right? But especially if you're in this healing process, the more aware you become, you are able to challenge that idea. You're able to remind yourself of the ways that you are strong. Like you're able to practice all of that in a very conscious and intentional place. But here's one of the challenges in this type of thing is that when we are reading something positive or hearing something positive, the more aware part of ourselves, the more healed part of ourselves, the more adult part of ourselves kind of stays with that and is able to be with that as a positive thing. But that fearful part, the unworthy part, the shameful part, that is picking up something totally different. And when that happens subconsciously or even unconsciously, because it's just this automatic thing that happens, then it has a really significant impact, because on a conscious level, you're kind of thinking like, oh, good for her, and literally feeling good about that and feeling happy for her. But then there's this other part of you on a physiological level that is responding maybe a little bit differently. Feels like, like maybe you don't breathe for a second. Maybe you feel this tightness or tension, this heaviness, this flutter in your chest or in your belly. Maybe you suddenly feel filled with shame. Maybe you don't know that you're filled with shame, but you just find this incredible reactionary response energetically. Maybe you suddenly withdraw and feel very numb or distracted and can't formulate a thought, don't know where your mind went. Those are the ways that we often tend to respond to things that are kind of below our consciousness. We can certainly respond in those ways when something is conscious, but it definitely happens more, and the intensity can be more significant when it is below that conscious level. And again, thinking about how this can happen in our everyday lives. And it doesn't even have to be specific to abuse. It can be somebody who talks about setting a boundary and the benefit that it has created for them in their life. And if you have struggled with boundaries, then you can take that and interpret it in a way that reinforces the idea that maybe you're not deserving of having boundaries because you haven't been able to do that yet. And what is wrong with you? You're never going to be able to do that. Who are you kidding? And again, maybe you're aware of that, and maybe you're not. You might just notice behaviorally changing a little bit. And maybe only upon reflection, you may not notice it at the time. In fact, there's a good chance you likely wouldn't notice it at the time. It would be upon reflection later on, which is, again, one of the reasons why journaling can be helpful, because it can help you reflect on your day in different situations and notice how things are coming up and the impact that it has on you in terms of thoughts or physiological responses in your body. If somebody is acknowledging something positive about you, you could even, especially if that person has been in your life for a while, you can also easily interpret that. Like if they're saying, for example, wow, dinner was really great tonight. And whether it's a dinner party for a bunch of people or it's for one other person, like that's a positive thing, right? But if you struggle with doubt, if you are anxious or fearful about disappointing somebody, or you don't trust your cooking skills, when somebody says, wow, dinner was great tonight, you can actually interpret that as all the other nights weren't. Or being fearful about the expectation that will create going forward. It can keep you from being able to just be in that moment, again, because of the layers, right? And that's probably not the best example. It was just what came to mind just then. But, or even like a therapist. If a therapist points out a moment of progress that they've recognized in some way and they point that out to you, that can often be internalized in a way, instead of being able to feel good about that, be able to connect to the truth of that progress, be able to feel proud about it. You might think about all the things that weren't specifically acknowledged in terms of progress. The next time that you think that you make progress, and if it's not specifically identified by your therapist, you might think, oh, this must not be a big deal. And again, my point to talking about this, to pointing out some of those very specific things, is so that you can begin to really recognize and honor, like really honor the reality of what it takes to heal, because of the ongoing impact throughout our everyday lives on what we believe about who we are. Because for most people, every day, there are going to be multiple opportunities that those core beliefs can be reinforced without anything bad having to happen. And it's also part of the reason why people will often feel shame or just bad in some way, like they're struggling, but they'll say something like, but there's nothing bad happening, so I really shouldn't be struggling. But the reality is nothing bad has to be happening in your current everyday life to struggle. In part because there's a lot for you probably to still heal, but also because every day there are opportunities for those beliefs to be reinforced. Day after day after day, which is part of the reason why healing takes the time and the practice that it does. Because especially again, when it is happening below our consciousness, the impact is even more significant. And the work that we have to do, the intentional work we have to do to kind of get out from under that is going to take a lot of work. Like if you think about being in a huge open area and each one of those experiences is like throwing more dirt on it. If there are multiple opportunities every day for all this dirt to be thrown in there, but the only way to get the dirt out is to be very intentional about doing it, it's going to take time, right? It's going to take intentional practice. It's going to take experiences that help you see that you can do something to get that dirt back out of there. Like if you're trying to fill a hole or make the hole or whatever, you can only get the dirt out when you are able to connect with real experiences that can help you see something different than what you have believed. I hope that makes sense. So ultimately, just giving yourself a break, being compassionate with yourself and this process, recognizing the reality of how frequently, easily, those beliefs are reinforced day in and day out. And that's even aside from just your thoughts going through your mind, right? Like just the things that when you're sitting on your own that you find yourself thinking about. But when there are things that in particular have an opportunity to reinforce something about your core beliefs, that's where it's really going to have the most impact. So I'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts? What did you notice coming up for you as you watched, as you listened, maybe even paused? share in the comments below. If you found this video helpful, make sure to give it a thumbs up. And again, if you haven't yet subscribed, make sure to do so and click the little bell for notifications. Thanks so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you next time.